it will look. In this lesson, I'll show you how to approach blending without making mud. We'll discuss gradations and highlights, and finish up by seeing how to add reflections. When we made our value scale, it was important to have clear endings and beginnings of different shades. We wanted to create a grid that indicated specific tones. When shading realistically, we want those tones to blend together so they appear seamlessly to move from dark to light or light to dark. So I'm going to show you an example of doing just that with pencil pressure. Instead of blocking in color, I'm going to press somewhat hard and then let up on my pressure. My goal is to gradually get lighter and lighter, like you would see a shadow or a shade in real life. It would gradually get lighter. Normally there aren't crisp lines of a dark and then suddenly light, except when you're dealing with highlights. But here we have a nice gradation from dark to light. So using pencil pressure is one way to create a nice seamless look. If you want it to appear even smoother, you can do a couple of things. One is use your finger. You can rub just a tiny little bit, or you can use this tool called a tortillon. It's basically a paper stump rolled up really tightly to a point where you can take this and just rub a little bit to blend. So I'm going to show you the proper way to do that at the top of our gradation that we created, and just very lightly I'm going to blend just a little bit back and forth. This is giving us a nice smooth appearance. However, the more I go over it, the more these tones are getting blended, as you can see over here in my light area. It's not as light as it was before. However, I'm getting a nice blend. You can go into territory of blending too much, and I'm getting there. The more you blend, the more muddled your shading gets, and those nice crisp tones from dark to light are now becoming the same flat muddled gray. The depth and dimension is gone from it. So you can overdo it. My rule of thumb is rub back and forth just 2 or 3 times, and that's it. Therefore, you won't be able to be in the danger of making mud. Line in a drawing can only suggest so much. Shading interprets an object or scene fully through the use of black and white, reflections, and shadows. To shade an object is to introduce the third dimension of depth and volume. Objects in real life don't have a solid outline around them, simply just a change in value. The same goes for a realistic drawing. You don't want to darken the outline, you want to darken the shadows. Let's take a look at this sphere. This is a white sphere on a white background. However, with all of the lights, highlights, and shadows, our obvious light source coming from the left-hand side is no longer white, but a series of nice, beautifully laid down gradations. There's several parts to this that are key to note when you're creating a shadow or looking at a drawing that is shaded. First, we have the lightest area. This is where the light source is hitting immediately. This is called the highlight. So the light source is hitting this directly, whether it's a lamp or it's natural sunlight, you're going to have a highlight on your object. The second area to look at would be the midtone. This is the area between the highlight and the darkest area of your shaded object, where you would lay down a medium gray, or whatever would translate well to this section. The next area is the core shadow. This is going to be the darkest part of the shape itself. This receives the least amount of light from the light source. Then a little tiny bit of reflected light. This is a circular object. A circle becomes a sphere when it's shaded, so we want this to appear realistic and three-dimensional, so it's a little sliver of reflected light, and it also can bounce off the table too, that shows that little bit of lightness. Finally, we have a cast shadow. This reiterates the direction of the light source, and it also affirms the fact that this is a three-dimensional drawn object that has depth. Gradations, highlights, core shadows, midtones, reflected light, cast shadows, all those things are necessary when drawing a realistic or shading a realistic 3D object. This is going to help us a bit when we move into our next section, drawing the human eye. Let's move on to drawing an eye. An eye is a lot like the sphere we just looked at, but with more detail. The glassy surface of the eye is a good place to start learning about reflections. I already have an outline here, and I've given you a basic outline in your class materials so you can draw along with me. If you want to draw this on your own, feel free to do so. I have just traced a circle, sketched a little one inside, and there's a couple of arches, really quick and easy to do. But like I said, if you don't want to go to that trouble, it is in your class materials. So let's start shading it in. I like to start with the dark areas first, but not getting too dark. So quick back and forth motion or a swirly motion as I'm doing here. Either way works. I'm going to fill in the pupil. The pupil is that dark black part of the center of the eye that is darkest on most people, along with the top lash line. There will be lashes here eventually, but for now, the sake of blocking in areas, I am going to just make a nice thick dark line that's going to act as our lash line. This will get a lot more detailed later, but for now, just give a nice thick line. Same thing down here. Not as dark, but we can fill that in a little bit. The goal here is to fill in all areas so there's not any bright white staring out at you. I'm working on the iris now. This is the brown, the green, the blue part of the eye, the colored portion of the eye that's going to translate as a nice mid-tone gray. Just blocking it in. Again, it will be a lot more detailed later. And we can get a little darker with it later too. Same thing with the sides of the eye. This is the white part of the eye, the sclera. In actuality, it is not white. We want to show that it is rounded to some extent, like a sphere. We'll darken it a little bit on the sides, gradually, 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 get a little bit lighter, just to make it appear rounded. And we'll blend this all out and smooth it out later. But for now, this works. The folds of the eye. Darken these up a little bit. These are areas that are not hitting the light as much as the lid would. So I'm just going to block this in. This is the bottom lid, this little section, it's going to be a little three-dimensional lid area. So underneath that is usually in shadow, so I'm going to indicate that with a nice light layer of shadow. And then finally, this little muscly section that you find in the center of the eye where the tear duct is, I'm just going to block that in. So that's the basic layers of tone for an eye. We're going to add a lot more detail to that next. So filling in the pupil. This is the darkest area of the eye, so we can go ahead and darken that up a lot. It's almost black. We want to have some nice vibrant shading here where there's some reflections and gradations, and right now it's pretty flat looking, so we're going to start the gradations right around the edge of the iris. I like to darken up the edge a little bit, then gradually as I get towards the center of the pupil, lighten up a little bit. This gives the iris a nice rim of darkness. Just helps it to pop and makes that little spherical idea of the eye stand out a little bit more too. So just rimming the edge a little bit with darkness. Underneath this lash line, this is going to throw a shadow onto the eye, so usually the top portion of the iris is going to be a little bit darker, along with the sclera, that white portion of the eye. There'll be a little bit of shadow on that as well. Then we can go ahead and do more gradations from this top lash line to the top of the lid, just so it's a little bit more gradual, a little more natural looking. Darkening it up just a little bit. And separating that little muscly piece from the white of the eyeball as well. Inside the iris, if you've ever looked at an eye close up, you'll see it's not one solid color. There's a lot of different beautiful colors going on in there with spokes almost radiating from the center of the pupil. I'm going to indicate that. This might start to look a little bit like a bicycle spoke, but for now this works. Just to give a little bit more depth and interest and realism to this eye. I'll go around again and make some different lengths to these spokes, some short, some long. It's making this circle somewhat disappear and blend out into the eye. We don't necessarily want to have outlines around things, more so definition by shading. So these lines, the outline of this eye, is eventually going to disappear and become part of the shadow of the eye. Notice the artwork is gradually coming together. There's not an instant, oh wow, that's gorgeous. This eventually happens over time. You're gradually blending, gradually adding more and more detail, and it starts to appear. It's not really instant gratification when it comes to this. Can add a little bit more shadow underneath to define this area. And I'm going to toss a little bit on this lid, just a little bit, just to separate this white tone from the white of the eye. I have a little bit of tone enough laid down to actually start blending. So what I am going to do is use my tortillon, which is this nice little paper stump, and I'm going to blend a little bit on the lash line out towards the outer lid. It's going to give me a nice blend. Sometimes a tortillon's a little bit too much, especially when it gets dirty. It starts to smudge a lot. I like to use my finger. It's quick, it's easy. You'll get a little bit dirty, but that's all right. It comes off. I'm just going to blend a tiny little bit. Get all these tones mixed in together so there's not any area that seems too harsh. I'm going to go back in and add another layer of tone. I'm getting darker and darker each time. This is making my lights stand out a lot more too. Nice light lights and dark darks creates beautiful contrast in a work. We are eventually going to draw lashes on this, but not until all of the shading is done. If we start putting lashes in now and keep blending, all those fine little hairlines of lashes are going to disappear. I'm going to go around the rim of this iris again. Just blend a little bit more. So I've added a little bit of detail to this, obviously not a lot yet. The reflection is the part that's going to make this really pop, make it look realistic. If you have any kind of reflection or light hitting the eye, it is going to reflect as a white spot or a shiny spot or a highlight. So to indicate that, I will erase a little bit. This can be anywhere on the pupil or on the iris. If you look at somebody in the eye, you'll see it in many different places. I'm going to throw mine in right here, and I'm just going to start erasing a little bit. This is where my highlight reflection is going to go. And I can tweak that up a little bit later, but for now that's just giving me an idea of where the highlight will be. Also, a little bit in this area, sometimes you'll see a reflection, so I'm going to indicate that by erasing just a little bit. I want to make this really pop, so I'm going to go around it with some darkness. This is going to help it to really stand out. So with the edge of my pencil, I'm going to outline a little bit, darken up the edge around it. This makes my highlight really stand out a little bit more. Don't be afraid to color inside of it a little bit as well, because we can always clean it up more with an eraser. And just adding more of these spokes, erasing areas in between those spokes is really going to add to making highlights and reflections as well. It can really help this stand out. So once I have my reflections in there, I can clean them up a little bit more, erase areas a little more, make them a little bit lighter, but really it's all personal preference. You could work on this for as long as you want until you're happy with it. Might even add a little bit of reflection in the pupil if you want to. Next up is to add lashes and just blend and smooth it out a little bit more. You can use your finger or your tortillon. Nice smooth look for an eye works, but still don't be wary of making mud. You don't want to smudge it too much so you don't have any of those nice beautiful tones. You do want to see a difference between the lights and the darks, especially around that highlight area. So after shading and blending and doing a little bit of erasing, I have a more polished looking eye. As you can see here, I've added the lash line above and below. Take note of the direction that these lashes go in. They don't all go in one direction, but they follow the curve of the eye and eventually become longer on the sides. Same thing at the bottom. And I've also added a little bit of a reflection of those lashes in the highlight to give it a little kick, make it look